Coca-Cola's first great victory in the Soviet world was so politically awkward that the drink reportedly had to be disguised as vodka. But here is the strange part. When ordinary Soviet citizens finally got an American color of their own, it was not Coke. It was Pepsi. So, how did the world's most powerful soft drink company lose an entire superpower's worth of market? According to later histories, Georgy Zhukov first encountered Coca-Cola through Dwight Eisenhower after World War II. The two commanders had come from fighting the same enemy to navigating an increasingly uneasy peace. Zhukov reportedly liked the drink, but openly consuming one of America's most recognizable products was politically uncomfortable for a celebrated Soviet marshal. So he allegedly asked whether Coke could be made to look less American. A Coca-Cola technician named Mladin Zarubika was assigned to the task. They removed the caramel coloring, bottled the drink in straight-sided transparent bottles, and put a white cap with a red star on top to complete the disguise. It was white Coke for a red marshal. The first shipment was reportedly 50 cases, but the story survives mainly through later company histories and recollections, with little confirmation from Soviet archives. We do not know exactly how much Zhukov drank, what Stalin knew, or whether the arrangement was ever as dangerous as retellings imply. What the story does reveal is a genuine problem. Coca-Cola was not politically neutral, or at least it wasn't seen that way by the Soviet public. So, how did Coca-Cola become a symbol of America? Coca-Cola began on the 8th of May, 1886, when pharmacist John Pemberton introduced it at Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta. Under businessman Asa Candler, it grew from a local fountain drink into a widely recognized product across the United States and Canada. Then, in 1915, Coca-Cola commissioned bottles so distinctive that it could be recognized in the dark, or even from a broken piece of glass. The resulting contour bottle entered use the following year and became one of the most recognizable packages in the world. But the decisive transformation came during World War II. After the United States entered the war, Coca-Cola President Robert Woodruff made an extraordinary pledge. Every American serviceman should be able to buy a bottle of Coke for 5 cents, wherever he was stationed and whatever it cost the company. Then, on June 19, 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower's Allied headquarters in North Africa requested 3 million bottles of Coca-Cola. For soldiers thousands of miles away, Coke became a taste of home. But for many civilians overseas, Coke arrived alongside American uniforms, military supplies, and the enormous industrial power of the United States. When the war ended, the overseas facilities, supply routes, and business relationships remained. What had begun as a wartime morale program became the foundation of a global commercial empire. Back home, Coca-Cola fit almost perfectly into America's post-war consumer culture. Andy Warhol later captured why that made it such a powerful American symbol. The president drank Coke, movie stars drank Coke, and ordinary people could buy exactly the same product. It was a compelling image of American democracy, except the reality was much less democratic. For decades, Coca-Cola's advertising offered black consumers very little representation. When black Americans did appear in earlier advertisements, they were often shown in subservient roles, as domestic workers or servants carrying trays. Coca-Cola began presenting black consumers more actively during the 1950s, after Pepsi had already made a concerted effort to court the black market through targeted advertising and sales campaigns. The company's role during the Civil Rights era was equally contradictory. After Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, much of Atlanta's white business establishment initially refused to support an interracial dinner honoring him. Coca-Cola president Paul Losting used the company's influence to pressure local business leaders, helping ensure that the event went ahead. Yet by 1968, in the final speech of his life, King called on his audience not to buy Coca-Cola as part of a broader campaign over jobs and economic fairness. That tension, a taste of home to some, a symbol of empire to others, followed the brand overseas. By 1959, the New Yorker noted that the foreign cartoonists were already using Coca-Cola bottles to represent American satellites, military aircraft, automobiles, and even Uncle Sam himself. Critics even coined the term for the process, Coca-Colonization. By the time Coca-Cola confronted the Soviet Union, it was no longer just a drink. Even Soviets who had never tasted it knew what the name represented. America in a bottle. People joked that Coke could eat through the stains in a toilet bowl. The Kremlin feared it could eat through something far tougher. Soviet ideology. But Pepsi was American too. So how did it cross the same ideological barrier and become the exception Coca-Cola could not? By the late 1950s, the Cold War had become as much a contest of everyday life as of missiles and ideology. Which system could deliver a better standard of living to the ordinary family? In July 1959, the United States tried to answer that question with an exhibition in Moscow. The American National Exhibition filled Sokolniki Park with cars, televisions, household appliances, fashion, food, and a model American home. On July 24th, Vice President Richard Nixon toured the exhibition with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The two men stopped inside the model kitchen and began arguing over which system offered people a better life. "This house can be bought for $14,000, Nixon said, and most American workers could afford it. Khrushchev was dismissive. "In Russia, all you have to do to get a house is to be born in the Soviet Union. You are entitled to housing." This was one of the Cold War's most famous confrontations, the kitchen debate. But while Nixon and Khrushchev argued about washing machines and political ideology, a Pepsi executive named Donald Kendall was preparing a much smaller demonstration, which may have mattered a lot more. Kendall was then running Pepsi's international business. He reportedly told Nixon that he needed Khrushchev at a Pepsi stand. Nixon brought him to the place, overflowing with photographers. Kendall handed the Soviet leader a cup. Khrushchev sniffed it. It smelled, he said, like shoe polish, and drank it anyway. Then came the photograph. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the communist world, drinking Pepsi in front of the cameras. The next day, foreign newspapers ran the photograph with a caption borrowed directly from Pepsi's own advertising slogan, "Khrushchev learns to be sociable." The company's tagline at the time was, "Be sociable, have a Pepsi." The leader of the communist world, photographed mid-sip, had just become the most unlikely spokesman in advertising history. Still, a photograph did not equal a market. Inside the Soviet Union, the image never ran. Then, in the early 1970s, relations began to thaw. President Richard Nixon pursued détente with the Soviet leadership, which made trade politically possible. And in 1972, Pepsi finally secured the breakthrough Kendall had been chasing for so long. The company would supply Pepsi concentrate and production equipment, and Soviet organizations would bottle and distribute the drink locally. And the deal solved the problem Coca-Cola had not solved: money. The Soviet ruble was not freely convertible. Pepsi could sell millions of bottles and pile up mountains of rubles, but those rubles could not be exchanged for dollars and transferred to New York. So Pepsi stopped waiting for conventional payment and took vodka instead. In 1974, the first Soviet Pepsi bottling plant opened in Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. Pepsi became the first Western consumer product manufactured and sold inside the Soviet Union. This was more than an American first. In an economy that normally kept foreign consumer brands off Soviet production lines, Pepsi was an extraordinary exception. A capitalist trademark being made inside communist factories. This was where Coca-Cola truly lost the opening round. Pepsi was no longer merely an imported symbol occasionally tasted at an exhibition. It started to become part of the Soviet production system. Then, Coca-Cola appeared to find its opening. The 1980 Summer Olympics were coming to Moscow, and Coca-Cola had a long relationship with the Games. The company had been an Olympic sponsor since 1928, making it one of the longest-running partnerships in Olympic history. In 1978, Coke secured the position of official soft drink supplier for the Moscow Games. It was the first time the Coca-Cola system had actually gained a retail foothold inside the Soviet Union. If the company could capitalize on the Olympics, its prospects in the Soviet market suddenly looked far from hopeless. Then, in December 1979, the Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. President Carter called for a boycott of the Moscow Games, and more than 60 countries around the world followed the United States' lead. Faced with what might have been a once-in-a-generation opening into the Soviet market, Coca-Cola did not want to let it go. The company refused to follow the American government's boycott, arguing that its Olympic commitments should remain separate from politics. It went further, publicly declaring itself a multinational corporation standing above politics, and continued to appear at the Games as the official soft drink supplier. But it would be a mistake to pretend the disruption was not real. El País reported in the run-up to the Games that Coca-Cola would be shut out entirely under its original Moscow contract. Once the Olympics opened, however, accounts suggest Coke did appear and sell on site. The boycott had made that breakthrough limited, chaotic, and short-lived, with some 71 to 85% of Americans supporting the boycott. Even appearing in Moscow had become a patriotic liability. Whatever publicity Coke gained that summer, it was never going to reassemble Khrushchev casually sipping a Pepsi in 1959. Coca-Cola, it seemed, was Napoleon meeting its second Waterloo. While Coke waited, Pepsi became part of Soviet life. By 1980, Moscow's 73 blue, white and red Pepsi kiosks could sell about 292,000 servings on a summer day, roughly one for every 28 Muscovites. By 1988, Soviet consumption had passed 1 billion servings a year. That May, a 5-commercial Pepsi campaign, including spots featuring Michael Jackson, reached an estimated primetime audience of 150 million. They were among the first paid American advertisements on Soviet television, helping define what would later be nicknamed the Pepsi generation. Why, even after the 1980 Moscow Olympics, was Coca-Cola still unable to expand across the Soviet market? The answer went back to 1972. Pepsi had secured a 10-year exclusive agreement covering cola production and sales. Coca-Cola's Olympic contract gave it temporary access to a single international event, not the right to bottle and sell Coke across the Soviet Union. Once the Games ended, the door effectively closed again. Then, on December 31st, 1984, Pepsi's exclusivity expired. In January 1985, Soviet authorities approved Coca-Cola. The announcement sounded enormous. Coke had gained access to 275 million potential consumers. But the opening was narrow. Imported Coke was initially limited to stores serving foreigners, while local bottling and mass distribution would take years. Unlike Pepsi, Coca-Cola still lacked the Soviet factories, state distribution network, and barter system needed to turn rubles into usable revenue. And it still could not take rubles home. So Coca-Cola copied Pepsi's barter model, exchanging its cola concentrate for Soviet-made Ladas cars. But unlike vodka, the cars were difficult to sell abroad and often needed costly modifications. The Lada was a perfectly good car, once Coca-Cola had spent 3 days rebuilding it. The deepest obstacle, however, was not logistics but meaning. Decades after Zhukov had asked for colorless Coca-Cola, the same dilemma remained. Soviets might enjoy the drink, but its unmistakably American image was much harder to swallow. Pepsi, by contrast, had Soviet bottling plants, familiar glass bottles, kiosks, and 13 years of consumer memory. Then, Pepsi did something no soft drink company had ever done. In 1989, the deal reached a level of absurdity that still sounds like an internet joke. How much Pepsi does it take to buy a navy? The answer was 17 decommissioned submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. The ships would never sail under a Pepsi flag. They were disarmed and bound for resale or the scrapyard. But for one surreal moment, the color wars had moved from supermarket shelves to the high seas. Donald Kendall reportedly joked to President Bush's national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." For a moment, Pepsi looked unbeatable. Coke had finally entered, but Pepsi had factories, loyalty, and even ships. Then, the ground beneath both companies disappeared. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The collapse of the Soviet Union placed Pepsi and Coca-Cola in completely different positions. For Pepsi, it was not simply a market disruption. Its trading partner had vanished. Donald Kendall later described the absurdity. Pepsi was left holding a multi-billion-dollar agreement signed with an entity that no longer existed. For Coca-Cola, however, the collapse removed nearly every obstacle that had once held it back. Coca-Cola expanded aggressively. By 1996, market research from that year showed that Coke had finally overtaken Pepsi as Russia's best-selling cola. But the deeper reason was not simply money or infrastructure. The two brands had exchanged meanings. In the Soviet Union, Pepsi had represented a rare opening to the West. But in the 1990s, the factories, state officials, and barter deals that had made Pepsi successful also connected it to the system Russians were trying to leave behind. Russian novelist Viktor Pelevin captured the irony. He joked that the children of the Soviet 70s chose Pepsi in precisely the same way as their parents chose Brezhnev. The joke was that neither generation had really chosen anything. Coca-Cola carried the opposite message. It represented a new Russia, dollars, international business, Western advertising, and the promise of joining the global consumer economy. What had once been Coca-Cola's greatest weakness, its unmistakably American identity, suddenly became its greatest advantage. Yet, the final outcome was one neither company could have expected. After 2022, Pepsi and Coca-Cola stopped producing their flagship colas in Russia. Their factories and distribution networks remained, but new local and localized brands took their place. By June 2025, such brands accounted for 95.5% of Russian soft drink sales. The red and blue cola war had ended, but neither red nor blue had won. Still, for many who grew up in the Soviet Union, Pepsi remained the stronger memory. One former Soviet child recalled that Pepsi was a rare childhood treat, sometimes enjoyed only once a year, or even once every few years. Even after Coca-Cola arrived, he remained loyal because Pepsi still tasted like magic. If you grew up in the Soviet Union, what did Pepsi and Coca-Cola mean to you? Tell us in the comments. This is Relish History. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the hidden history behind what people eat, and sometimes what they drink.